Kubrick. Let's rank Kubrick's movies. I actually own most of these in individual editions as well. The only ones I don't are what? Eyes Wide Shut, Barry Lyndon, and Lolita. I think I own the rest in individual editions. But yeah. So let's go ahead and rank his movies. You can see my complete thoughts about Kubrick's cultural influence up here. Otherwise, let's just jump into the rankings. Number 13 is Fear and Desire. This movie is bad. It is his first film. He gathered a few $1,000s, a handful of friends, went from New York City out into the countryside and made a war movie. War movies by people who have never been close to war are usually a little pretentious, and this movie is incredibly pretentious. It has absolutely nothing interesting to say about the wartime experience because, well, Kubrick had no experience with war. He just knew he was against it, and so trying to create this like physical, psychological reality of what it means to be in war just ends up coming off silly. And the fact that it is delivered with such pretense just makes it all the worse. It's extremely obvious why Kubrick actually tried to have this movie destroyed several years later. I think this might have been better left as kind of a what if in our minds rather than an actual film, because the film itself is genuinely hard to sit through. It is just shallow and pretentious and hard to take, and I genuinely kind of hate watching it. That being said, Kubrick shows from very early on that he actually does have a very strong eye when it comes to framing shots, and there's actually quite a bit that looks really good, especially towards the end, and when it it's nighttime and in the shack and there's a murder going on. It actually looks quite good. But it's simply way too little, way too late. The movie is a pretentious bore from a kid who just has absolutely no idea what he's doing in terms of actually putting together a narrative and a film. And if I had been there in the early 50s and watched this, I would have said Kubrick had no future in the movies. I would tell him to go back to New York and be a dentist, because it's genuinely awful. Number 12 is Killer's Kiss. Now, this is his second movie, and I actually think it's pretty good. Kubrick also kind of disowned this film. He said he kind of wanted people to forget that he ever made it. But where Fear and Desire represented a completely talentless, directionless, pretentious kid with, a certain eye, having no idea what he was doing, Killer's Kiss represents someone who actually is really trying and actually has figured out some of the basic elements of storytelling in the cinematic medium. It's kind of a simple noirish film. It's very much kind of that era, like On the Waterfront, finding gritty reality in New York and having that kind of help bring life to the film. And I think it works. It's ultimately a story about a young guy and a young girl who decide to flee the city to try to move to Seattle. He's a boxer. She works in a dance hall. And there are obstacles between them and their freedom, represented by, the man who lusts after her. And the film is honestly too short for its own good. It's only 67 minutes long. It needs a solid 10, maybe 15 minutes more. Not a whole lot. It's just, the entire courtship between the two characters is really, really short. It's mostly done in voiceover instead of actual, scenes, which I do think prevents the film from kind of reaching a real emotional climax. However, the last act, which is a chase over rooftops and through a warehouse full of dolls, is like shockingly good to look at. And exciting, and there's enough leading up to it that it actually does have some kind of emotional follow-through. It's not great, but it's some, and it ends up being this work by a promising young filmmaker, where after the Fear and Desire, I wanted him to go and become a dentist. After Killer's Kiss, I want him to keep making movies. He actually grew a lot in between the two, and I don't think it's something that he should have felt ashamed about. I actually think it's quite accomplished. Number 11 is Lolita. Now, this was made in direct response to Spartacus. Kubrick found the direction of Spartacus to be a deadening affair. He just kind of hated the entire experience. He was very much a director for hire, and he disowned that. And so in response, towards the end of production, he started figuring out what could be the anti-Spartacus. And he went towards the novel Lolita. And very much is. It is the story not of a hero, but of an absolute scumbag. It's very small. It's in black and white. There's no epicness to it. It is kind of the perfect antecedent to Spartacus in every way. And I like it. I think it's a good film. It's weird, though. The performances are all very good. It looks great. Soulian is very good as the young ingenue who kind of develops into her own character, into her own woman through this predatory relationship with her stepfather, Humbert, played by James Mason, a wonderful James Mason. My issue is that it's weirdly, ironically romantic in a way that makes the film weirdly sympathetic to Humbert because he's a complete scumbag. He marries Shelley Winters simply so he can get close to this 14-year-old girl that he's obsessed with. And, you know, by the end, it almost feels like the film is pushing it into tragedy because he doesn't get what he wants. It's an intentional stylistic choice, I think, on the part of Kubrick's filmmaking decisions in order to do that, and I just find it kind of weird. However, the actual text of the story is very clear in making Humbert an absolute monster. He's a terrible, awful person, and it's very clear from that. And my other real problem is Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers was this great comic personality and talent from the 50s, and I've rarely found him that funny. Every single scene he's in, he's supposed to be kind of laugh out loud hilarious, and when you're not laughing with Peter Sellers in his scenes, the scenes end up kind of muted. I wouldn't go so far as to say dead, but kind of muted, where they should be uproariously funny. So I don't get carried away with that, and I find the actual tone of the film kind of off-putting, but ultimately, the text of it is there and very clear. The performances are really good, and you know, it looks great. So I end up feeling like it's minor Kubrick, but it's a good example of his talent. Number 10 is Spartacus. This is his director for hire job. Kirk Douglas fired the original director, I believe it was Anthony Mann, and he just brought on his director from Paths of Glory, the young Stanley Kubrick, to just do what he said. Kirk Douglas was a very domineering personality on movie sets. He hired directors pretty much to bully them into doing what he wanted. And then you combine that with the Dalton Trumbo script, which Kubrick never actually liked, and you have this very impersonal project from Kubrick in an entire filmography that is just personal projects. So it kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. That being said, in terms of early 60s sword and sandal epics, it's quite accomplished. It tells a very long, sweeping story about a young man, a young slave who decides to lead a revolt against Rome, and you know what? It lays out the pieces clearly, and it does them well. I don't find it the most compelling thing in the world because Dalton Trumbo wrote his main characters as boringly as possible. It was a very intentional political choice on his part in order to demonstrate the new socialist man in art, and I never find these new socialist men compelling. I find them boring. And Spartacus himself, once he gets out of captivity, is boring. And that leaves people like Laurence Olivier as the Roman general, and Tony Curtis and Gene Simmons as the actual interesting characters, and they're all supporting roles that are just swirling around Spartacus's story. That being said, the grand sweep of everything is just a thrill on its own. I just find it ultimately impersonal from Kubrick, but more importantly, a handsome, slightly empty, but entertaining film. Number 9 is Full Metal Jacket. I fall in with the crowd on this. I think the first half is brilliant. I find the second half disappointing. However, I really feel like the second half is really informed by the first in ways that I simply haven't uncovered yet. I am open to the fact that the entire movie is brilliant, not just the first half. There are echoes in the second half that call back to the first that just feel intentional and purposeful, but the execution of them just doesn't seem to follow through as well as it should. The second half is somewhat disappointing, and it's helped not at all by the fact that Kubrick filmed in England, and he can't hide the fact that he filmed in England by bringing half-dead palm trees. It's kind of an unfortunate production choice I don't know if it mars the second half, but it doesn't help. So it's the story of boot camp at Parris Island in South Carolina. It's this portrait of turning men into unthinking killing machines, and it is wildly compelling, deeply anchored by that wonderful performance by Arlie Ermy, who just attacks the role with gusto, a role that he actually fulfilled in real life, since he had been a drill sergeant before he went to Hollywood to advise on technical matters in military films, which, led him to getting the part because Kubrick liked him more than the actual actor he had hired. And it's that first half, just that portrait of the dehumanizing nature of boot camp is incredibly compelling. I find it interesting to hear military members talk about it. I had a high school professor who did 3 tours in the Marines about the time that this is set, and he was pretty much okay with it. He said it went a bit too far in a couple places, like, Ermy punching someone in the gut. He's like, that would never happen. But other than that, he's like, yeah, that's pretty much what it was. And he never really felt bad about, the implication that he had been turned into an unthinking killing machine. He was a warm, wonderful man. I loved his classes. Anyway, and then the second half starts, and it's kind of a typical war movie. It's incredibly well filmed. There's a lot of good acting. There's a lot of interesting stuff done with irony. It's just not as compelling. I want it to be. I keep rewatching the film, expecting it to kind of open up in that second half in a way that I haven't noticed before, but it keeps not happening. So in the end, I end up falling in with everyone else, where it's like the first half is great, the second half is a disappointment, and it ends up kind of minor Kubrick in that way. Number 8 is The Killing. This is Kubrick's third film, and you really feel the growth from one to the next, from Fear and Desire to Killer's Kiss to this. This is incredibly assured noir. It is a very focused heist film. It has wonderful acting, and it is just kind of an all-around entertaining package of a young filmmaker with obvious talent, like really kind of stretching himself on a narrative structural point of view. Just kind of, twisting things in certain ways to make them increasingly interesting over time. Anchored by a wonderful central performance by Sterling Hayden, who just kind of dominates every scene he's in pretty much every movie he's in, but definitely in this. It tells the story of a heist at a racetrack and how it all ends up going wrong in the end. About how, this pursuit of material wealth is ultimately empty and meaningless. What that view of the money just kind of flittering away in the wind on the tarmac is just a marvelous way to end the film, where all of this effort, all of this death, all of this criminality has ultimately led to absolutely nothing. It's ultimately a deeply moral tale on that ground, which I think goes against a certain word against Kubrick, that he's ultimately a nihilist. And I mean, he's kind of against materialism, and I think that it's a great way to demonstrate that. The absolute tautness of all of these sequences that he kind of pieces together over time, the incredible specificity of the actual characters who are going through everything, just creates this wonderful noir package that's just in and out real fast, and just creates this marvelous production from beginning to end that shows that early in his career, Kubrick had real talent. I'm glad he didn't stop at Fear and Desire. Number 7 is A Clockwork Orange. Now, just a quick funny story. When I was young, I was first discovering movies, and I loved 2001, mostly because of Roger Ebert, and I was already falling into auteur theory, and I asked my mother, well, I want to see more Kubrick films. Can I watch A Clockwork Orange? She was so mad at me. She ended up saying I could read the book, and then I could watch the movie. I only read the book like last year. And you know what? I find the film really kind of frustrating on a certain level. One, it is Kubrick at the height of his cinematic powers. it's hard to imagine him making, like, just from a craft point of view, making better movies. It really is up there. My problem is that it's like incredibly obvious what the movie is about. It takes particular lines of dialogue from the book and it kind of highlights them in certain ways that makes it incredibly obvious what this actual message of the story is. So there's no like digging, there's no wondering on the part of the audience. It's just kind of spoon-fed to us. In particular, there's a line from the preacher in the prison that, again, is straight from the book, but is, because the book is much wordier, especially in terms of its dialogue scenes, it doesn't stand out as much within the book itself. But because there's so little dialogue, in actual scenes in this film, it stands out more. And it's just like, okay, I get the point. And I don't need that spoon-fed to me like halfway through the film. Just, dial it back, maybe cut it out completely. I don't know. That being said, I actually think this is better than the book. The book ends with a terrible 21st chapter, which I think is awful. Anthony Burgess wrote a foreword to the UK edition that includes that chapter. The American edition did not include the chapter because his American editor said it was terrible. But the UK edition includes a foreword that kind of explains the final chapter, and I don't buy it. I think it's awful. I think cutting out was actually the good decision. Because this portrait of evil in the form of Alex, the central droog who just is in love with the ultra-violence along with his other droogs, gets imprisoned and brainwashed, but ultimately they can't defeat him. They can't defeat his individuality, no matter how criminal he actually is ultimately the point. It's the ironic celebration of liberty, but also bemoaning of the youth that is at the heart of the book. And Kubrick films everything incredibly well, and Malcolm McDowell is a marvelous central performance as he just loves himself in every single scene. It's so fantastic. I just feel like there are particular lines of dialogue dotted throughout that just make it way too obvious what the film is trying to do, when I feel like it's actually better to kind of push that a bit further under the surface to allow us as the audience to engage with it on a more interesting level. Number 7A is AI, artificial intelligence. No, I'm not stupid. I don't think Kubrick actually directed this. However, I find it really interesting and I like talking about it. So Kubrick shepherded the project for several years, about a decade or so, going through several writers before deciding that ultimately he couldn't crack certain elements of it and he was probably the wrong filmmaker for the movie anyway. Eventually kind of pushing Spielberg to do it, and then after Kubrick died, Spielberg decided that as homage to his friend, he was going to take on the project as his next. And what I kind of find interesting is the fact that most people seem to misunderstand where Kubrick is most prevalent in the film and where Spielberg is the most prevalent. Everyone kind of blames Spielberg for the ending, which they hate. But it's actually what Kubrick couldn't crack was the second act. The first act and the third act are pure Kubrick. And the third act represents a deep misunderstanding of what's actually happening. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that Spielberg fell in love with John Williams', piece of music that he wrote. And, it's this melodic, beautiful, hopeful thing. And, Spielberg just kind of cut to the music. It's an 8-minute long sequence that he just cut to that music. And it creates this impression that it's a happy ending. But if you actually look at the actual text of the film, not like a script, but the actual just what's happening, it's actually a really sad ending. So David, the robot from the past, who was only programmed to love, can literally do nothing else but love. He has a completely stunted development and he can grow no further. So thousands of years old, having begged the blue fairy to have his mother love him again, all he can do when brought back is insist on having his mother with him. And so the future robots observe what they can from him, and then he dies. They essentially put him down. It's like the creation of David was an act of cruelty against David. And I think that gets lost because, kind of how Spielberg edits the ending. But the actual text of it is very obvious to me that it's ultimately a tragic tale of someone just kind of lost in a world that they literally will never be able to understand. I think the first 40 minutes of the film might be the best thing that Spielberg ever made. It's pure Kubrick. It is surprisingly warm and inviting, but cold and sterile at the same time. It's kind of a beautiful 40 minutes. The middle 40 minutes kind of feel lost and jumbled because, yeah, Kubrick never quite figured it out, and then Spielberg kind of just threw something together. Spielberg has the sole writing credit on the film. I think it's one of 2 films where he actually has writing credit on it. The other one is Close Encounters of the Third Kind, which, you know, was based on an early draft by Paul Schrader. But here it feels like he just kind of jumbled together a couple of action sequences in the middle in order to get David and Gigolo Joe from one place to the next. And ultimately what really matters is getting David to Manhattan. And once he actually gets there, it kind of settles back into its groove again, and I think is beautiful again. So no, Kubrick didn't direct it. Kubrick never quite cracked the second act. But you know what? I like to include it on the list anyway because there's so much Kubrick DNA in it, even though that Spielberg did, you know, all of the actual work on set. So nice little detour, but I like talking about AI. Number 6 is Eyes Wide Shut. Now this is Kubrick's most purely experiential film. It really is just trying to create a sense of unreality. In particular, the focus is on dreams. You know, the entire night that Tom Cruise follows as he wanders these very fake feeling streets of New York follows the logic of dreams. He wanders into a weird situation, things happen, he wanders out and he wanders into another weird situation. It is very much the logic of dreams, you know, and the fact that everything is set at night, everything kind of feels unreal. You know, it's all feeding this idea that we're walking through a dream. And then the next day when he wakes up and he tries to revisit all of these places and like nothing is as it seemed, you know, it's trying to reclaim something that never really quite existed as it was. I find that incredibly hypnotic. From a purely filmmaking point of view, I just find this his most hypnotic film. The film that I get into and I just never quite find a way out. Now, is it the film that he ultimately would have finished if he had lived another year or so and been able to keep editing? Probably not. I imagine a bunch of changes would have happened. It might have been longer, it might have been shorter, I have no idea. But ultimately what we have is very distinctly Kubrickian, and it's this, you know, it's this ultimately this tale of like unrealized infidelity between Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, kind of, you know, heightened by the fact that they were a real married couple at the time. And it's this marvelous feeling of unreality as we're drifting through kind of jealousy and desire, and, you know, and it's ultimately an exploration about like what is actually important in relationships. And, you know, there's no solid answer because this is a Kubrick film that's not a Clockwork Orange, and it creates this, you know, overriding sense of hope by the end, where, you know, they were close to infidelity. Maybe they actually did it. Did Nicole Kidman actually sleep with that sailor? It's unclear. Was it just kind of a veiled threat? I don't know. Did Tom Cruise actually do anything that night that he just can't remember? But ultimately, the entire experience kind of refocuses them on what's really important. And I find it ultimately a very hopeful ending. I don't think that's out of step with Kubrick. I think Kubrick was ultimately very much a humanitarian. He was just kind of cold, and, you know, he had obvious trouble connecting with people. But I think underneath it all, it's this hope for the future, and I think Eyes Wide Shut, ironically, actually represents something like that. We just have to get through very weird sights and sounds to get there. Number 5 is The Shining. This is pure horror. Obviously, the story of Jack Torrance, who takes his small family up into the Colorado Rockies in order to just kind of get away from the world, to focus on his writing, and take care of the Overlook Hotel while it's abandoned through winter. And I think it is appreciably better than the novel. I know a lot of people love Stephen King's novel, original novel. I find Stephen King is full-on cocaine-fueled towards the end. The obsession with the hotel's lore I find completely unnecessary, and the entire thing about the topiary animals is the exact wrong kind of horror for the book. Stripping all of that out and making it more purely psychological is the exact right thing for the story. It focuses everything on Jack and his own individual problems, and I think it works marvelously. I think Jack Nicholson is actually great in the role. He is not a man who's insane at the beginning. He's a man obviously beset by demons. He's a man who is holding back anger, but he's not necessarily a man who's going to lash out. He's a man in control, but with demons underneath. That's what I see in those early scenes. And when the demons are unleashed, whether it's from the alcohol, whether it's from ghosts, whether it's from just pure insanity, it's just this terrifying vision of horror that inverts something that should be safe. It takes the family and it makes it deeply unsafe. And I love it. I find no real hidden meanings in it. The whole thing about how it's about, Native Americans or the moon landing or whatever else it is, I don't buy into. Ultimately, my favorite is probably The Gold Standard. But outside of that, I ultimately just see it as this, character-based horror film that's really about inverting the family and making it absolutely terrifying because the father lets out a monster from within him. The fact that it's filmed in bright lights and is so terrifying at the same time is an incredible testament to Kubrick's ability to put together sequences. And you know what? It's just a great time at the movies. It's nothing I would show my kid, at least not yet, but ultimately I think I saw this for the first time when I was 13. I got to the bathroom scene and I immediately turned it off because it scared me so much. I can sit down and watch it now, no problem. But ultimately, it's there is real terror here, and I don't find that much in movies. It's I watch a lot of horror movies just because I watch anything, but very little of it actually feels like terror. And this feels like terror, and it is an incredible accomplishment by Kubrick, and I think it should be celebrated. I do think it's one of his best films. Number 4 is Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. This movie is really funny in very dark ways, and it just kind of hits me right where I need it. I have this very dark sense of humor, and I think A Clockwork Orange is actually a dark comedy, and I love it, but this is kind of the pinnacle of that. This is obviously taken from the novel Failsafe, and Kubrick was planning on adapting it very straight, but he just found the entire concept of mutual assured destruction so ridiculous that he turned the actual story into a comedy. And it works remarkably well because he is holding up a mirror to the ridiculousness of mutually assured destruction. And, the idea that ultimately it only works, as a deterrent unless someone crazy is actually involved. So it can only work as a deterrent against rational men. It can't work as a deterrent against irrational men. And what happens if an irrational man decides, his purity of essence has been tainted? So you have this marvelous performance by Sterling Hayden as General Jack D. Ripper, who just is so completely driven insane by his own paranoia that he starts a nuclear war. And you have all of these other great performances all around them. Yes, Peter Sellers gets all of the attention because he plays 3 roles. He plays Colonel Mandrake, he plays the President, and he plays the titular Dr. Strangelove. And you know what? Much like in Lolita, I don't find him in particular hilarious, but in Dr. Strangelove, there's so much more that is actually really, really funny. I actually find Sellers funnier here than in Lolita, especially as Mandrake. Just his befuddled quietness up against Jack D. Ripper is actually quite funny. Him as the President, I don't think is particularly funny, and Dr. Dr. Strangelove is kind of out there, which has its own entertainment value, but I'm not sure if it's like comedy. But I really think the center of it all is George C. Scott. George C. Scott is probably my favorite actor. Him declining the Oscar is something I highly respect him for. And he was just a great performer in kind of everything I've seen him in. And here he just has this marvelous presence of a man who is just kind of at the top of everything, but is still in over his head. And he is actually kind of the prime source of character-based comedy. But then you also have someone like Slim Pickens, who is much funnier than Sellers, and who just every line of dialogue is kind of hilarious as he is guiding his men on this blind mission to bomb Russia. And we have these iconic images of him riding the bomb, and the special effects they're largely unconvincing, which I don't know if it's intentional or not, but ultimately I don't think it really matters that much. And I find just the entire film to be just really, really funny. I get on its wavelength, I understand its point, and it is a complete entertainment. Number 3 is Paths of Glory. This is kind of the height of his pre-Discovery by Hollywood period. He obviously hired Kirk Douglas, but there's still very much kind of a New York-based cast. And it's his most nakedly humanist movie. It is a plea for people to not throw bodies into the grinder of war using World War I trench warfare, which would fight for months, for inches, for literal inches on the ground, just to kind of feed general egos. And you know what? Kind of every cliche about terrible military generals is made very real by very real people in World War I, especially French generals. They were kind of awful. And, the story of these French soldiers who refuse to go over the line under certain death and are sentenced to death for their cowardice, taken up in their defense by, Kirk Douglas in a wonderful central performance as Colonel Dax, it's really surprisingly touching because it ultimately, they're deaths that are completely meaningless that leadership decides must be taken just to set an example so that they can continue to order further senseless deaths. It is this wonderful humanist tale of people looking for some sort of meaning, some sort of life within the middle of all of this death, and kind of the uncaring people outside of it who are making it happen. I want to take a quick moment to talk about accents. I hold this up as a great example of people not doing funny accents when they're playing characters from different countries. Everyone speaks in a New York accent here, and it never comes close to breaking the reality. Yes, they're playing French soldiers, but they're speaking English anyway, so is putting them in silly French accents that almost none of them could probably hold for more than a couple of lines going to help the film at all? Or can we just lose ourselves in these accents, accept them, and move on? I really think that this sort of embrace of just kind of taking actors and letting them play roles straight without funny accents is a good thing. Something similar happened in Death to Stalin. It wasn't everyone's actual accents, but it was a predominantly American accented film set in Russia, where all the characters were Russian, and it also works. So filmmakers, you don't have to make them say silly things in silly accents. You can just have them say things in their normal accents, and we can buy it. It's fine. We're not stupid. So yes. Anyway, still, this is one of Kubrick's best films, and it's surprisingly warm and human, and it's just a marvelous production. Number 2 is Barry Lyndon. Now, in my top 10 video of all time, I very explicitly said that if forced to redo my top 10, I would actually have trouble choosing between Barry Lyndon and 2001 to go on to my top 10, because I love Barry Lyndon a lot. I think this movie is fantastic. It is very slow, it is very contemplative, and I completely get into its groove. This is kind of the pinnacle of how Kubrick made movies, and I just find how he made movies incredibly hypnotic. The story of a young man who decides to go off and make his fortune, loses everything, gains everything, cons his way into marriage, and, ultimately dies with nothing is, it's a Kubrick movie, so, unless you're talking about Paths of Glory, it's usually kind of a cold affair, and I think that cold distance actually really does help the film. Ryan O'Neal plays an awful person, and I think kind of having a step removed from him and just observing his rise and downfall, telegraphing it with intertitles that actually explain it completely in very short words, it is ultimately a great thing for the film. He is not the best actor in the world, but he does feel like a guy who is just kind of, barely hanging on, and I think it works exceptionally well. The film is absolutely gorgeous to look at. I don't feel his rise and fall because I don't like him and I'm not supposed to like him. And it's just this clear observation in very beautiful filming, of a man who is the seeds of his own destruction. There's a certain Greek tragic aspect to it all. And I just find it wildly compelling, while at the same time, Kubrick pretty much hypnotizes me as I watch it because of his very slow, steady, precise filming. I think it's an absolute triumph. It's not like fun, but I actually have a great time watching it every time I do. It's like a solid 3 hours, and the time just kind of flies by because I never feel like looking away from the screen. The movie's gorgeous. The narrative is very clear. The narrative is actually quite compelling, even if it's not quite touching. But that's kind of what I expect from a Kubrick film. I expect interesting, but not necessarily touching. And I think this just kind of exemplifies everything that makes Kubrick a great filmmaker. I absolutely love this film. I find it hard to actually recommend to other people because it's so long, so cold, and so, distant. But ultimately, that's not what these lists are. These lists are just about what I like, and you know what? I love this film. Number 1 is 2001: A Space Odyssey. I have loved this movie for a very, very long time. All of the hypnotism I feel during Barry Lyndon, I feel in equal measure here. And I just find the sci-fi setting to be a perfect mesh with how Kubrick just tells his stories. So it's, the story of Jupiter mission, a mission fly to Jupiter to investigate a mysterious monolith, twin to a monolith that humanity discovered, twice discovered. First in the primate era, just kind of in Africa, and second on the moon, upon our first landing on the moon. And this tale of human discovery matched really, really well with Arthur C. Clarke's baseline story, based on The Sentinel, and Clarke co-wrote the script. And I really feel like Kubrick's inclinations towards downplaying things, towards pulling back from audiences, kind of helped bring out the best from Clarke. Clarke has this tendency in his writing to treat humanity as a child race, and he has his own personal reasons for that. Clarke was probably an awful, awful person personally, and Sri Lanka was happy to tolerate it. But Kubrick, by drawing it back, by making it subtler, by making it less explicit, tells this story of human evolution needing to leap forward at a certain point in our near future, and makes it really, really compelling rather than kind of overbearingly paternalistic. And that is told by making humans feel robotic. It's a very intentional choice on Kubrick's part that actually fits the material extremely well. Humanity has reached an endpoint in their evolution. They've stopped being human and they've become like the robots that they've built. And ironically, the most human character, the character that we actually end up feeling most emotionally for, is the robot HAL 9000, who is kind of caught in between orders. We find out explicitly what happened in 2010, which makes it a little less compelling. But You know, he's caught in between things, and his pleas for life at the end are the most endearing thing in the entire film. But the film just, of course, keeps going because we have these strange sights and sounds to observe, and they're fantastic. The Stargate sequence is amazing, and I love how it's just so out there visually, but it has absolutely no time to actually explain what's going on because Kubrick trusts his audience in a way that Clarke never did. And I find that incredibly compelling and wonderful to just absorb. I am just given time with the sights and the sounds to absorb them and to just kind of, come to my own conclusion, which is not that complicated to figure out. There's a radio interview of Kubrick from later in life where he explains explicitly what happens at the end of the movie. And yes, it's not that hard to figure out. It's actually pretty straightforward. And you know what? It's great entertainment. I love this movie. I love watching it. I love putting it in and just watching it. I actually watch it surprisingly regularly. And I don't think that's a negative, obviously. It's obviously a huge positive. I don't understand people who find it boring because I get so much out of it every single time I watch it. You need to be quiet, you need to be attentive, and you need to be able to stick with a scene that has set itself up to take place over the course of a few minutes. And if you really consistently sit through it, for the full 2.5 hours, you're going to get great entertainment. And that's ultimately why I love it. So that's it. That's all of Kubrick, including AI, artificial intelligence. And you know what? I really think the guy was really, really good at making movies. I am not unique in saying that. I am one of a million people who has said that on YouTube before. But this is my own personal take on just his ranking. And you know what? I like watching Kubrick movies. They're cold, they're distant, they're different, but you know what? They're beautiful, they're surprisingly intelligent, and sometimes they're actually quite touching. You kind of have to cut through his Asperger's in order to get there, but they're shockingly consistently. So yeah, so that's Kubrick, that's my ranking, and it's definitive.